1997 as Assemblies of God missionaries. And I will give you some things that you may not know here in a few moments. But Reverend Jacob Brema, his father was a Bible school student when I was a small boy. And my father was principal of the Bible school. And I used to follow his father around all the time and trouble him. And then later, Jacob was in our household in Yendi when my wife and I were missionaries, Assemblies of God missionaries in Yendi. And as for the Tiga family, Baba Tiga, this man's grandfather, and my father, Baba Goodwin, were so close. They were so close. And then later, Brother Sammy came and worked with me in Accra and so on and on and on, we can tell you. And there are others here I should mention, I'm sure. So forgive me. But there's more to talk about than we know how. But Jean Gladys said she wanted me just to share some of the things from our years of relationship. And I'm going to give you something in a few minutes to take with you, but before that, I want to touch on something that God does, and God did for me. My brother, my senior brother, who grew up in Yendi and in Boku, came back to Ghana as an Assemblies of God missionary in 1962. 45 days after his arrival, as they were preparing to have the Christmas crusade in Tili, which is close between Bolagatanga and Boku in the Upper East. He and my father were going to preach this crusade together. It was going to be my brother's first crusade as an adult missionary in Ghana. And he had a generator, a petrol generator in the pickup, and somehow it exploded and burned him, and he died 8 days later. And we buried him in Boku. My only biological brother, planted tragically in the soil of Ghana. But the stories we could tell you of what God has done with his death and the sacrifice that he made. But God gave me two brothers to replace the one I lost. Simon Asori and David Mankrom Nabegmado. Many people did not understand our relationship. They didn't understand our friendship. But it went so far back. And losing one, we were grateful for the extra years we had my brother Simon Asori. But David and I had so many plans. So many things yet to do. He was not supposed to go first. But he was a man who was passionate after God. Oh, the adventures I can tell you of the times that he and I had in Gambia trying to start the churches there, and the things that went wrong. and the people that tried to deceive us and all that happened there. I could talk about so many other things. When his uncle Samson Mancrone, which is where the Mancrone comes from, and I'll tell you why it was so important to his life in a moment. When his uncle Samson Mancrone passed away, and they were having his funeral at Yakashia in the hometown. And I told David, I'll be there. But all the problems I had trying to get there, up in the northeast side of Ghana. And I was with another close friend who is taller and bigger than I am. And we were driving a little tiny Nissan Sunny, a brown one, and in the brown red dust of northern Ghana, and we couldn't find how to get to this place. And in the midst of Uncle Samson's funeral, we came over a hill from a direction that nobody thought a small car could ever come from. And two huge men came out of that tiny car, but we were completely red from the dirt. You couldn't tell which one was supposed to be white or black or what. And I don't think anyone that was at that funeral will ever forget. But I made it. David would call me, and if it was a strange number, my first question, he always said to me, yellow, not hello, because that's what I said to him. And the first question I always said, where in the world are you today? It could be China, it could be any place. You never knew. Jean Gladys, we have a photo somewhere, and we'll find it, of our youngest daughter, Lenice, when she was about 2 years old, trying to carry Jean Gladys on her back. We stayed together so much. Here in the States, when we would travel, my brother David liked to stay at the La Quinta Inns, because when we did that, we got extra points for free rooms, and he liked that. And they have big signs everywhere. Wake up on the bright side. And he liked that, because he always did. But for many, many years, we stayed together. We slept in villages, in the compound. Oh, he liked to sleep outside and look at the stars, and he would talk my ear off. And then we stayed in hotels. Some people put us in nice places. Some people put us in places we won't talk about. But somewhere along the way, about 20, 25 years ago, I said, David, we're not sleeping in the same room anymore, because I'm getting to be old. And you wake up and start praying at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then at 4:30, you're on the phone to someplace in the world, because you're pastoring people all over the world. And when, I don't know about the other old men here, when you wake an old man up, he can't go back to sleep. So I said, from now on, you're going to have a different room for me, because I need to sleep so I can drive you tomorrow. Well, we could go on and on and on. But today, if he were here, he would say to you, we're in the Father's house. Relax. Relax. Be at rest. You're in your Father's house. Be free. We're all family, because we're in our Father's house. Is that true? So tonight, we're together in the Father's house. My friend Shirley was one of God's greatest warriors, and I consider 5-star generals. He's gone home far too early for us. Far too early for us. When Jean and I were talking some time ago, and we both were struggling. I struggled. And I told her, I said, the only way I know how to deal with this, Jean Gladys, is that David walked so close to God that the time came, God said, you have done everything I need you to do. I need you here. And I'm going to use your blood as seed for the kingdom. We don't understand it. But he lived a full and joyful life as if he had lived to be 95. And we honor and we rejoice in that full life. He sent me a photo of himself standing with his Christmas tree up in the house 4 minutes before he left us. Because when he was home on Sunday morning, he always WhatsApped with me just before he walked into the pulpit. And Sunday night, by the time he finished with all the committee meetings and the counseling and the what 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 that went on, if I was there, he would come and wake me up. He didn't wake Mama Comfort up. He would come wake me up, and we will sit and drink hibiscus tea. And when I wasn't there, he would call me and talk from wherever he was and talk until I would realize he was sleeping, and so I would finally hang up. He did the same thing with In so many ways, David and I were each other's safe place. I could bear my heart to him, and he would bear his heart to me. We could share each other's challenges, joys, and victories. These kinds of friends are rare. They don't happen. They don't happen. And I was blessed to have him as my friend. He started his life as a throwaway baby, as my wife said. And that's when our lives began to be intertwined. In early 1938, you understood me right, 38, my father, Homer Goodwin, rode his horse into Concombaland. Those from the Concomba representatives here. My father rode into Concombaland in 1938 by horseback. And he stayed in the chief's compound in Saboba for about 10 days, just beginning to know them and to share the gospel with them. Eating the food, sleeping in the compound in the chief's place in Saboba. There were 3 Concomba converts that urged him to go, and they went with him. Later in the 1940s, my father made it his routine to always stop and make the effort to go back into Concombaland, to go to Saboba in that area and see how the converts were doing. On one visit he made in the early 1940s, there was a new British colonial district commissioner who had been sent there, and he had taken it upon himself to decide that the Concomba people will be kept as an anthropological sample and never be exposed to Western civilization. And so he told my father, this is your last trip here. You cannot come back. By then, my father had started the Assemblies of God work in Accra If you're familiar with Evangel Church in Accra, my father was the founder. And my father went back to Accra and through a series of miracles found his way to the governor's office, and he told the governor the story. And the governor of the Gold Coast colony said, that is not British policy. He said, if you will guarantee that your mission will start a clinic there, we will give you that house the DC has built, and you can move in and bring nurses and start the work there. And he did. It was one of the nurses from New Mexico, Charlize Spencer, and one of the nurses from Pennsylvania, Helen Kopp, that were there in 1954. Charlize Spencer was called into missions through my parents' ministry in New Mexico. And for years, she sent 50 cents a month to support my parents. Because she came from a poor family, 50 cents every month she sent to support my parents and God. Then she went and spent many years as a nurse there. But Mama Charlize was there. David's mother died when he was 2 weeks old. The custom at that time was that that mother was cursed. I mean, the baby was cursed, I'm sorry. And so the baby would be left to die. No one would nurse him. And so Samson Mancrom's wife, who was in her 50s by then, said, this baby will not die. She was a convert. She was a Christian. And Samson was a school teacher. And they had begun educating those from the area. And she took David as an infant and walked the 16 miles to the clinic and begged the nurses, Charlize Spencer and Helen Kopp, and said, please help me save this baby's life. And those nurses, 1954, they had no formula, but they had powdered whole cream milk, and so they worked on it. They had the only kitchen in the area that had sterile water. And so they made a place for her to stay and keep the baby. And their kitchen provided the sterile formula that they mixed up for him. And that's how he lived. It was because somebody responded to the call of missions that he was able to. Now you understand his passion for missions? Someone responded to the call to missions. That's why he lived. And he went back to the village when he was weaned, came back to Saboba for school, and grew up with the other nurses. One reason he was able to move between cultures so easily is he grew up with all of these American nurses. And he moved back and forth between cultures all of his life. I have no idea where I am on this. But in my father-in-law, as you've already heard, had known David all of his life. David had an encounter with God, and he felt called to go into ministry. He met the Bible school committee. The committee, as committees do in their infinite wisdom of committees, said, no, you're too young, you're too small, you can't come. My father-in-law, Franklin McCorkle, was principal of the Bible school. He said, I'm taking it on myself. You let him come. And he said, listen, if he's not head of his class by midterm, I will put him in my car and take him back to Saboba myself. But he said, let me tell you, he will be head of his class. I know. And he was. And he was through graduation. Simon Asori and David Nabegmado made a decision in 1972. I don't know if they just made the decision or prayed it through or what. They knew me. I had been there. And my wife came and spent her summer with her parents. And all that summer, they would keep coming up to my wife and saying, Amonasu, have you told John yes yet? And she would say no. And if he asked me, I'll say no. And they would sneak up behind her when she's walking down the path after evening prayers in the dark there in the campus in Kabungu. And they would start singing Sunday school songs. But they would put my name in there. Oh, how I love John. And so they kept it up. That was in the summer of 1972. By November of 1972, we were engaged. So were it not for them, who knows? David had a way, and he learned a principle of honoring those that went before him. You can see it on the buildings in Tema. There's a name of some apostle, someone, pastor, someone that went ahead on the buildings. He gave honor to whom honor was due. He did it all the time. I took him several times to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to be with Mama Charlize. And then when she passed, David and my wife and I drove out there, and David and I preached her funeral. And David carried her coffin as well. At my father-in-law's funeral, he was in the family car with us. We were all getting out of the family car at the cemetery. And the girls started saying, "Where's Uncle David? Where's Uncle David? Where's Uncle David?" They lost him. I said, "Look, he's up there." He was already going up the hill, had his hands on the coffin with the pallbearers, making sure he carried his Bible school principle to the grave. Honor to where honor was due, a principle he lived by, and one we can learn from. He had a lifestyle of giving. Gee, Gladys, do you know how many cars he gave away? I mean, he had a BMW that anybody would want. I love to ride in that car. He gave it away. He told them to sell it to build a church. He left us walking. But if God said do it, he did. I would pick him up somewhere and he would be carrying his clothes in a plastic bag. I always teased him about his bush luggage. And I would buy him luggage. And the next time I pick him up, he'd be carrying his clothes in a plastic. I said, what? I just bought you something. Oh, well, there was a pastor that needed it more than I did. He was responsible for introducing me to technology. He was the one that convinced me. First, he gave me his cell phone and said, learn how to use it. And then later convinced me to buy my first cell phone. And pushed me to learn what to do with email. He was the one, he pressed me for music. He loved gospel music, beautiful, any kind of music, Christian music, gospel music. Every time, what are you bringing me? Which new albums are you sending me? And I don't know how many pen drives of music I gave him. I wonder where they all are now. Probably gave them all away. to Bishop T.D. Jakes. He loved his wife and his children and his adopted extended family so much. And all of our years of ministry together, our world travel together, our time together, not one time ever did I hear him speak ill of Osafo Mami Comfort. He would only praise her. And if anyone was around that he would have confided anything in, it would have been me, but he never. He was so proud of his daughters. And he always made sure I knew that he had one more daughter than I did. He loved his grandchildren. He was so proud of them. After Mama Charlize's funeral, we were in Lubbock, Texas, and he was determined to find cowboy hats to fit the grandsons. We spent hours till we found the right ones, even though we were trying to make a long journey that day. The only reason that I was not sitting beside him that day was because I had some health issues. When Melody was getting married, he called me and he said, Melody is getting married. I came and did Sharice's wedding. You're coming to do Melody's wedding. I said, okay. But then I had a serious ear infection. I could not fly to California. Then I had a problem that came back with my heart. I could not leave for Ghana in time. And I was trying to come for the 50th. I couldn't get there. The doctor said you cannot travel. And I was trying to come anyway. And on that Sunday, the plan was for me to be with him at that church, in that place. And I would have been with him. So I would have been with him there. But he said, don't come until you're well. Get your health in order. And so we did. I miss these days. I will miss the adventure of faith that we had. Our times of drinking our hibiscus tea together. Thank you, David Mensa, for introducing both of us to hibiscus tea. Today, we remember the blessing that David Nabegmado was to all of us. True servant of God, one of God's great warriors, a true friend when all others fail. What more can we say? Please dance in our Lord's presence and rejoice in the true victory that only the saints of the Almighty God can know. Today, he's in the presence of God, dancing and rejoicing in that victory.